The first thing I heard was the chainsaw. That vicious, high-pitched snarl cutting through the early morning air, shredding the quiet of my kitchen like it was paper. I remember dropping the mug in my hand. It shattered across the tile, coffee searing my bare feet, but I barely felt the sting. My eyes had already darted out the window, drawn by that guttural roar and the sickening crunch of wood splintering. When I saw it, my oak tree trembling, its massive trunk groaning as the chains dug deeper, my lungs forgot how to breathe. Sawdust swirled in the air like a golden fog, catching the pale sunlight, choking me before I even opened the door. I could smell gasoline, sharp and oily, stinging my nostrils as I stumbled barefoot onto the porch. The sound of the chain grinding into bark was like teeth on bone, cruel and unstoppable. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking against the buzz. The men in reflective vests barely looked at me, their faces shielded by earmuffs and goggles. But the couple standing smugly on the sidewalk, sipping coffee like they were watching a morning show, they looked right at me. Tom lifted his mug in a mock toast. Carol tilted her head and smiled, slow and cold, the steam from her cup curling around her like smoke. I ran toward the tree, gravel stabbing my bare feet, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the saw for a moment. The trunk was vibrating beneath my hand when I reached it, every shudder racing up my arm. My palm scraped against the rough bark, catching on the grooves my father had carved decades ago, grooves that held the initials of my entire family. It was like feeling the pulse of something alive, and then that pulse skipped. A crack, thunderous and sharp, split the air. The ground shook beneath me as the oak leaned, groaned, and fell. I could hear birds shrieking, wings beating wildly. A family of squirrels shot from a hollow in the trunk, their tiny bodies scattering across the grass like survivors fleeing a burning building. The smell of crushed leaves, damp earth, and raw sap filled my nose, thick and cloying. My throat burned, and my knees buckled, the impact of the tree echoing in my chest. Behind me, Tom clapped, slow and deliberate. "Now that's a view," he said, his voice syrupy and cruel. Carol laughed softly, like the sound of glass breaking underfoot. I turned to them, my whole body trembling, my face wet and hot. "That was my father's tree," I choked out, but my words sounded small against the whine of the saws winding down. Carol shrugged, swirling her coffee. "It was in the way. You'll thank us later." Her perfume carried across the breeze, sweet, cloying, suffocating. I wanted to retch. For a moment, silence swallowed the street. Just the sound of the leaves settling, branches creaking as they came to rest. Then a creak from the porch behind me, Lily's small, trembling voice, "Mom?" She was in her pajamas, hair sticking up, her eyes wide with shock. The sight of her clutching the doorway, knuckles white, ripped something inside me open. I pulled her close, the warmth of her body anchoring me as the air seemed to grow colder around us. She pressed her face against my chest, and I felt her breath hitch, dampening my shirt. The smell of her shampoo, coconut and cheap lavender, mixed with the acrid stink of fuel and raw wood. The contrast made my stomach churn. I looked at the stump, jagged, raw, bleeding sap like a wound. My father's initials had been in that trunk. My husband had strung lights through those branches on our last Christmas together. Lily had carved her little heart into the bark just last summer. Every memory of our family shaded by that tree now lay scattered in splinters, ground into the dirt under someone else's boots. Something inside me hardened, sharp as glass. My grief twisted into something hotter, something I hadn't felt in years, rage. My hands clenched, sticky with sap, nails biting into my palms. The chainsaw's echo still rattled in my skull, but beneath it, a new sound grew louder, my own heartbeat, steady and sure. Tom noticed the shift in my face, because his smirk faltered for the first time. He cleared his throat, muttering something to Carol about cleaning up the mess. They turned away as if I were nothing but noise. That dismissal, that arrogant shrug of my pain, was the spark. I lowered my voice, so low that only Lily heard me. My lips brushed her hair as I whispered, "They just made the worst mistake of their lives." She tilted her head, eyes still glistening, but her gaze sharpened at my tone. I could feel her small fingers grip mine tighter, sticky with the coffee I had spilled earlier. She didn't ask what I meant. She just leaned against me, silent, as if she already knew. The man dragged the last branches to a truck, the smell of fresh sap and exhaust burning the air. A gust of wind sent sawdust swirling again, coating my skin in grit. It clung to my lips, bitter as ash. The stump loomed in front of me, grotesque, almost mocking in the slant of its rings. As the trucks pulled away, their engines rattling down the street, I stood there barefoot on the crushed grass, the silence after their departure heavier than any noise. My chest rose and fell, the air cold now that the sun no longer broke through those branches. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I only stared at the stump, my jaw tight, my throat raw from shouting. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the ache, a dark calm settled. Like soil being pressed over a seed. And in that silence, one thought rooted itself so firmly it nearly took my breath away. If they thought cutting down my tree would give them peace, they had no idea what they had just planted instead. The stump still glistened with sap when the memories came flooding back, sharper than the chainsaw that had cut it down. I closed my eyes, and suddenly it wasn't a corpse of wood anymore, it was alive again. The sound of cicadas hummed in the background, my father's deep voice reading aloud under the shade, his pipe smoke curling sweet and earthy through the summer air. I could almost taste the cold lemonade he'd hand me, beads of condensation dripping down the glass onto my bare legs. In that instant, I wasn't a grown woman standing barefoot in the ruin of my yard. I was 8 years old again, tracing the bark with my fingers while my dad told me the oak was a guardian, as long as it stands, so do we. His hand was rough and warm on my shoulder, the scent of sawdust clinging to his flannel shirt after long days in the workshop. And later, after he was gone, that tree had become my refuge. When grief strangled me, I'd press my forehead to its trunk, cool and steady against my skin, and feel steadied too. Then came another memory, jagged and bittersweet, my husband stringing twinkle lights through the branches one December, the bulbs casting warm halos on his face as he teased me for being too sentimental. The oak became the stage for every moment that mattered, Lily's first wobbly steps on the grass beneath it, her laughter ringing as she scrambled up the lower limbs, barbecue smoke curling around us as friends and neighbors gathered for 4th of July cookouts. That tree wasn't a backdrop. It was the spine of our family history. And now it was gone. Cut down not by storm or disease, but by arrogance, by spite dressed up as entitlement. The grief burned hotter than I expected. It wasn't just the loss of the tree, it was the way Tom and Carol had stood there, sipping their coffee like they'd done me a favor. The taste of bile rose in my throat, bitter as ashes. Lily slipped her hand into mine, pulling me back to the present. Her palm was sticky from the spilled coffee inside, and I clutched it tighter than I should have. She looked up at me, her lashes clumped with tears, her small voice trembling. "Grandpa's tree, it's gone, Mom." I could only nod, my throat swollen shut. The smell of sap and gasoline hung heavy in the air, but beneath it, I caught the faint salt of her tears. Inside the house, I tried to clean up, though every movement felt mechanical. I swept shards of the broken mug, their edges glinting like teeth, and washed the sticky coffee from my feet. The water ran warm over my skin, but it couldn't wash away the cold pit in my stomach. Each scrape of the broom against tile echoed like an accusation, "You didn't protect it. You let them win." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the chainsaw revving, saw the oak tilting, felt the ground quake. Around midnight, I got up and stood at the window. The moonlight revealed the stump glowing pale and raw, a wound in the earth. For a heartbeat, it almost looked like it was bleeding. I swear, in that moment, I could hear my father's voice again, faint, steady, telling me, "Don't let them take what's ours." Weeks earlier, the tension with Tom and Carol had been simmering. I remembered the first time they complained about the tree. Carol had wrinkled her nose at the shade spilling across their immaculate patio, saying it made their afternoons too chilly. Tom grumbled about falling leaves, as if raking once a year was beneath him. They sent letters to the HOA, demanding I take it down. Each time, I fought back with photographs, documents, proof that the tree was healthy, historic, protected even. When the board finally sided with me, I thought the matter was done. I had underestimated just how far spite could reach. I kept hearing their laughter that morning, cruel and mocking, reverberating through the walls of my house. Even when I tried to cook dinner, the sizzle of onions in the pan seemed to morph into the rasp of their voices. I pushed the food around on my plate, tasting nothing but ash. Lily barely ate, her fork scraping the ceramic like nails on a chalkboard. Finally, she whispered, "Why do they hate us?" I had no answer that would soothe her. The next day, I tried to carry on, but everywhere I looked, the tree's absence screamed at me. The backyard felt too exposed, naked, the sun harsh where once there had been dappled shade. The grass was littered with sawdust that clung to my toes like grit. Even the air seemed different, emptier, thinner. My neighbors, though, looked satisfied. Every time I glimpsed them across the fence, their smiles stretched too wide. Tom whistled cheerfully while washing his car, water splashing over chrome, while Carol preened among her flower beds like a queen surveying conquered land. I avoided them, but they made sure I couldn't forget. At a neighborhood gathering the following weekend, Tom clapped me on the back with the false cheer of a salesman. "You'll see," he said, the smell of beer thick on his breath, "your property value's gonna shoot up now. Should be thanking us." His words were loud enough for the circle around us to hear, and laughter rippled through the crowd. My cheeks flamed, hot as the grill smoke curling into the air, and I forced a smile so brittle it hurt. Carol leaned in, her perfume sharp, floral, cloying. "It really does open up the view. We can see the mountains perfectly now. You should come over sometime and look. Breathtaking." She emphasized the word like a blade sliding in. My stomach twisted, and I excused myself, but not before catching the smirks of neighbors who had once complimented my yard. Their eyes flicked away when I met them, like I was suddenly invisible. That night, I found Lily curled up on the couch, knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't watching the TV flickering in front of her, she was staring at her reflection in the dark screen. "They laughed at me," she murmured when I asked what was wrong. Her voice was flat, heavy. "At school, the other kids had parroted their parents, 'Your mom's crying over wood.'" She bit her lip so hard it left a mark, and the silence that followed was worse than any sob. I held her, brushing her hair back, the smell of her shampoo sweet against my nose, but it did little to ease the weight pressing down on both of us. I felt the scrape of her nails against my arm as she clutched me tighter. That scarred stump outside wasn't just mocking me, it was mocking her too. Everywhere I turned, reminders stabbed at me. The swing that used to dangle from the oak's thick branch now lay coiled in the shed, the rope frayed and smelling faintly of mildew. The patio lights that once twinkled in its canopy sat tangled in a box, the bulbs dusty and dull. I couldn't even sit on my porch without feeling the sun scorch my skin, a constant reminder of what had been taken. And yet, beneath the grief, something else was building, coiling tighter every day. The stump wasn't just a scar, it was a challenge. Each time I walked past it, my pulse quickened, and I felt the sting of my nails digging crescents into my palms. My father's words echoed louder in my mind, "As long as it stands, so do we." But now it didn't stand, and that meant it was my turn. I caught myself staring across the fence at Tom and Carol one evening. They sat on their deck, wine glasses clinking, laughing at some private joke. The sinking sun painted their smug faces gold. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the taste of copper at the back of my throat, and an image bloomed so clear it startled me, their perfect view, ruined by something far greater than a tree. I didn't know what form it would take yet. But as the last light faded, the wind rustled the leaves of the remaining shrubs in my yard, whispering like a promise. My grief had been carved open into anger, and anger could be shaped, sharpened. The next morning, I walked out barefoot into the grass still wet with dew. I placed my hand on the stump, sticky with dried sap, and closed my eyes. For a fleeting second, I swore the wood pulsed beneath my palm, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. My breath caught, and a shiver ran up my spine. When I opened my eyes, the sun was rising directly over Tom and Carol's house, spilling light across their perfect deck. And in that moment, standing in the raw scar of my yard, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they thought they had won. But this story wasn't finished, not yet. It started small, so small I almost convinced myself I could ignore it. The first jab came a few days later, when I stepped outside with a basket of laundry. Tom was leaning against his fence, the smell of cigar smoke drifting across the yard like an unwanted guest. He smirked at me through the haze. "Looks like you've got more sunlight now. Good for the laundry." His voice was casual, but every syllable dripped with mockery. The basket dug into my hip as my hands tightened, knuckles pale, but I said nothing. I thought maybe silence would choke their cruelty. But silence, I learned quickly, was gasoline to them. At the grocery store, Carol accidentally blocked the aisle with her cart, eyeing my bruised bananas before commenting loudly, "Some people just don't know how to maintain their property, or their produce." Her perfume, thick and floral, mixed with the metallic chill of the freezer section until I felt sick. Other shoppers glanced at me, then away, their smirks sharp as knives. The humiliation was spreading like smoke through dry brush. At the next HOA meeting, Tom stood during open discussion, his shirt starched, smelling faintly of aftershave and arrogance. "We did the neighborhood a favor," he announced. "That tree was rotting. Unsafe. Property values are safer now." Laughter bubbled from a few corners, sharp and stinging, while I sat frozen, the cheap plastic chair creaking beneath me. My throat tasted of pennies, the words I wanted to spit out dissolving into silence. I caught Lily's eyes across the room, wide and wet, her nails digging into her notebook. When I squeezed her hand afterward, her skin was icy despite the warmth of the crowded hall. She didn't say a word, but the disappointment in her gaze cut deeper than any insult Tom could hurl. I had promised her strength, and here I was, silent, shrinking. Back home, I tried to shake it off. I chopped vegetables for dinner, the knife thudding rhythmically against the cutting board. But each strike wasn't against carrots or onions, it was against their laughter replaying in my head. The scent of garlic filled the kitchen, but it soured in my stomach. I slammed the knife down harder than I meant to, splintering the board. Lily flinched from the couch. I forced a smile, but the metallic taste of guilt coated my tongue. Then came the cruelest cut of all. I overheard Lily on the phone one evening, her voice hushed, breaking. "They keep saying Mom's crazy, that she cries over trees." I just don't know what to say back. My chest caved at her words, and I pressed my hand to the doorframe, splinters biting my palm. I had become a punchline, and worse, I had dragged her into it. The next morning, I caught sight of the stump again. Dew clung to its raw surface, glistening like tears. For the first time, I didn't just see what was lost. I saw what it represented, my weakness, their victory. My breath hitched as a new thought struck me. What if this scar in the ground could be transformed into a weapon? The image was fleeting, but it left me trembling. Tom and Carol weren't finished, though. They found new ways to twist the knife. They began tossing their yard waste over the fence, brittle twigs and grass clippings piling against mine. One afternoon I opened my trash bin and gagged at the sour reek of rotting food they had dumped their leftovers in with my bags. The smell of spoiled milk and rancid meat clung to my hands long after I washed them. I tried confronting them once, my voice tight, shaking. Tom only leaned against his railing, sipping from a tumbler of whiskey, ice clinking softly. "You should thank us for all this attention," he said, his grin wolfish in the fading light. The sound of ice cracking in his glass drowned out my reply, and I walked back inside, my nails leaving half-moons in my palms. But the humiliation reached its peak one Saturday night. The neighborhood barbecue, once my favorite tradition, now felt like enemy territory. The air was thick with the smell of burgers and charcoal, the crackle of grease popping over flames. I stood stiff at the edge of the crowd, paper plate trembling in my hand. Then Tom raised his glass, voice booming, "Here's to clear skies and better views, thanks to a little initiative." The cheer that followed shattered me. Neighbors clinked bottles, laughter rang out, and someone even patted him on the back like he was a hero. The heat of the grill washed over my face, suffocating, as my vision blurred. I couldn't taste the food on my tongue, only bitterness. Carol caught my eye across the yard, her smile ablaze, and mouthed, "You're welcome." I dropped my plate, the food splattering across the grass, unnoticed amid the revelry. My legs carried me home in a blur, the sting of smoke still in my nostrils, my throat raw with words I couldn't force out. By the time I reached my kitchen, tears had carved salt down my cheeks. I slammed the door, the echo rattling the glass, and slid to the floor, the cool tile biting against my skin. But when I looked up, Lily was there, standing in the doorway. The glow from the porch light behind her framed her small figure, her eyes red but burning. "Mom," she said, her voice steady in a way I'd never heard before, "are we really just going to let them win?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence after the oak fell. My chest tightened, breath hitching. I wanted to tell her no, to promise her we would fight back. But all I managed was silence, thick and suffocating. And in that silence, I felt something shift again, deeper, darker. My tears dried on my cheeks as I stared at her. She didn't flinch under my gaze. She was waiting, and she deserved an answer. My pulse thundered in my ears, and beneath it, I heard the whisper of leaves that no longer existed. I didn't give her words. I gave her a look, sharp as steel, that said more than I could speak aloud. And in her eyes, I saw recognition, fear, yes, but also hope. She understood, this wasn't the end. The laughter from the barbecue still drifted faintly through the open window, cruel and careless. It was fuel now, feeding something inside me I could no longer contain. The stump outside wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was a starting line. I stood slowly, brushing the grit of tile from my palms, and walked past her toward the darkened porch. The night air was cool against my face, carrying the faint char of grilled meat and the sour tang of spilled beer. The stump loomed in the shadows, jagged, defiant. And as I stared at it, one thought coiled tight in my chest: if they thought their cruelty had broken me, they were about to learn how dangerous broken things could become. It didn't stop with words or whispers. A week after the barbecue, I woke to find trash strewn across my front lawn, plastic wrappers glinting with dew, the sour reek of beer cans and rotting food hitting me before I even stepped off the porch. The bags had been split open, their contents dragged out, and a trail of greasy chicken bones pointed straight toward Tom and Carol's yard like an arrow. My stomach lurched at the smell, at the buzzing flies already circling, but what burned more was the smug laughter I heard through their open kitchen window. I bent down, my fingers sinking into something wet and slimy. The bile rose in my throat, sharp as vinegar, but I forced myself to keep gathering it. Each crumpled can, each soggy napkin felt like a deliberate slap across my face. Lily stood behind me, silent, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Her eyes were red, but not from tears this time, from anger. I saw it burning there, the same fire I felt, and that both terrified and steadied me. When I confronted Tom later, my voice low and trembling with rage, he didn't even bother pretending. He leaned back in his lawn chair, the creak of wicker loud in the quiet afternoon, sipping whiskey from a glass that caught the sun. "Proof," he said, shrugging. "Maybe raccoons did it. You know how nature is." His smirk widened, teeth glinting like knives. The smell of his cigar smoke clung to me even after I stormed away. Everywhere I turned, they made sure the humiliation grew. They joked loudly when I walked past, calling me tree widow as if grief were something to laugh at. One afternoon, I caught Carol watering her flowers, her hose spraying in an arc that just happened to splash over onto my side of the fence. "Oops," she said, her voice syrupy, though her eyes sparkled with malice. The icy spray soaked through my shirt, plastering it to my skin. I could smell the chemical tang of her fertilizer mixing with the water. She laughed as though it were the funniest thing in the world. And yet, I tried to endure, to keep my head down, until the night that shattered whatever restraint I had left. The neighborhood held another gathering, this one a summer barbecue on the green. The air was heavy with charcoal smoke and the sweet, greasy smell of ribs, children shrieking as they darted between folding tables. I stood at the edge again, paper plate in hand, willing myself invisible. But Tom spotted me. He always did. He raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the firelight, and bellowed, "A toast to clear skies, open views, and neighbors who finally learned their place." The crowd erupted with laughter, clinking cups and bottles, the sound crashing over me like thunder. I felt heat crawl up my neck, sweat prickling under my collar even though the evening breeze was cool. My stomach churned, the bite of potato salad on my tongue suddenly sour as bile. Carol joined in, her voice ringing sharper than the crack of the grill. I almost forgot what the mountains looked like until we took matters into our own hands. She gestured toward the horizon, where the setting sun painted the peaks in gold and crimson. For a moment, the sight was breathtaking, but their words poisoned it, turned beauty into a weapon. I tried to set my plate down quietly, but my hands shook, and the paper collapsed under the weight. Food splattered across the grass, a smear of barbecue sauce staining my shoes. Laughter rippled louder, some of it directed at me now, and my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. The taste of smoke and grease clung to the back of my throat, thick and choking. I turned and fled, the crunch of gravel under my shoes too loud in my ears. By the time I slammed my own door shut, my chest was heaving, the cool air of my kitchen a weak balm against the fire in my veins. I slid down to the floor, my palms scraping against the rough tile, breath coming in ragged bursts. And that's when I saw her, Lily, sitting cross-legged in the living room doorway, her face pale but her eyes fierce. The faint glow of the porch light framed her like a silhouette. She didn't cry this time. She didn't even tremble. She just asked, her voice calm and cutting, "Mom, are we just going to let them win?" Her words struck harder than anything Tom or Carol had said. They carried the weight of every insult, every humiliation, and something more, her faith in me. My lips parted, but no words came out. My throat was dry, tasting of smoke and salt, and all I could do was stare at her. In that silence, I realized something. It wasn't just about me anymore. They weren't only mocking my grief. They were teaching my daughter that cruelty wins, that silence equals surrender. And that, I couldn't allow. The thought coiled in my chest like barbed wire, painful but steadying. I stood, my legs weak but carrying me forward. I reached for Lily's hand, her skin cool and trembling, and held it until my grip steadied. Her gaze searched mine, and though I said nothing, she understood. Her shoulders straightened, and a flicker of hope lit in her eyes. I walked to the back door and opened it. The night air was cool, tinged with the smoky aftertaste of grilled meat drifting from the green. Crickets hummed in the distance, their song sharp against the quiet. The stump loomed in the moonlight, pale and jagged, a scar carved deep into the earth. I stepped onto the porch, bare feet brushing against the rough wood. The boards were cold under my skin. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath catching in my chest. The memory of laughter still clung to me, but underneath it, something else surged, anger hardened into resolve. The stump wasn't a reminder of defeat anymore. It was a challenge, an unfinished story. The wind rustled through the leaves of the smaller shrubs, carrying the faint scent of soil and grass. It sounded almost like a whisper, urging me forward. I placed my hand on the stump, the surface rough and sticky with dried sap, and felt a shiver run up my arm. My father's words echoed again in my mind, steady and sure, "As long as it stands, so do we." And though the oak was gone, I realized with startling clarity, it wasn't the tree that needed to stand now. It was me. My chest rose, steady this time, and I whispered to the night, "This isn't over." Behind me, Lily's footsteps creaked on the porch boards as she joined me. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against my arm, her hair tickling my skin, carrying the faint scent of her coconut shampoo. Together we stared at the stump, and I felt the heat of determination settle in my bones. Because if Tom and Carol thought they had won, they had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the sky still that bruised shade of purple before the sun claws its way up. The house was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the faint rustle of Lily shifting in her sleep down the hall. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stump through the window. In the early light it looked less like a wound and more like a foundation, a raw stage waiting for something to rise from it. My fingers tapped against the chipped mug in my hand, the bitter smell of coffee coiling up into my nose, steadying me. An idea had taken root overnight, as insistent as a heartbeat. If they wanted the view, I'd give them one they'd never forget. Something bigger, bolder, impossible to ignore. I pulled out a notebook, the paper rough beneath my fingers, and began sketching shapes. My pen scratched furiously, black lines curving into something wild and defiant, an installation, not just a tree. Steel, stone, wood, maybe even light. A monument to endurance that would tower higher than their smug little horizon. By the time Lily padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and smelling faintly of sleep and toothpaste, the table was littered with crumpled sketches. She peered down, her brow furrowed, then slowly lifted her gaze to me. "You're building something?" she whispered, like she didn't want to jinx it. I nodded, my throat tight, and she smiled, a quick, fierce grin that made my chest ache with pride. That afternoon, I drove into town, the air sharp with the tang of asphalt baking in the sun. My old pickup rattled down Main Street, past the hardware store, past the lumber yard. Every time I pushed open a door, the smell of sawdust, oil, and metal wrapped around me. I bought wood, bolts, wire, paint, even lights that pulsed faintly blue in the fluorescent aisles. My arms ached carrying it all, the coarse bite of rope leaving ridges in my palms, but with every trip back to the truck, my determination hardened. At home, I hauled the materials into the yard. The neighbors watched, of course they did. Carol stood on her porch with a glass of lemonade, her nails clicking against the rim as she whispered something to Tom. He barked out a laugh, loud enough for me to hear, his cigarette smoke curling into the air, acrid and bitter. Their stares pressed against me like heat, but I didn't look up. I set the first plank on the stump and let the hammer ring out, sharp and metallic, a sound that cut through the air like a challenge. The first days were messy. My hands blistered, my back screamed, and sawdust clung to my skin in a fine, itchy film. At night, I collapsed onto the couch, every muscle trembling. But when I closed my eyes, I saw it, the shape forming, the way it would rise. Lily helped, her small hands passing me nails, her voice chattering about colors and lights. Her laughter mixed with the hammer strikes, weaving music into the labor. For the first time in weeks, I caught myself smiling without guilt. Then one evening, just as the frame began to take shape, something unexpected happened. A knock at the door, firm, hesitant. When I opened it, there stood Marlene from across the street, a woman who usually kept to herself. Her eyes darted toward the yard, then back to me. She smelled faintly of lavender, her perfume clinging even in the night air. "I saw what you're building," she said softly. "If you need extra hands, my nephew's good with welding." Her words startled me. Help? From someone outside my circle of pain? I almost refused out of habit, but then Lily appeared behind me, her hopeful eyes wide. So I swallowed the pride thick in my throat and nodded. That weekend, her nephew arrived with sparks flying from his torch, the metallic tang of burning steel filling the air as he welded pieces I could never have joined myself. The sound sizzled and cracked, like the project itself was alive. Soon, more neighbors trickled in, not the cruel ones, but the quiet ones who had kept their distance before. An old man brought buckets of stone, saying it looked like the kind of thing that deserved a foundation. A teenager offered to string the lights, her fingers nimble as she worked, the bulbs glowing soft and warm against the twilight. With each new hand, the project grew, and so did something in me, something that tasted like hope. Tom and Carol noticed, of course. They always noticed. I caught them whispering, their eyes sharp with suspicion, their voices carrying over the fence. "What the hell is she doing?" Tom muttered. One morning, he even started over, pretending casual with his coffee cup steaming in his hand. "You know, property lines are tricky," he said, his tone oily. "Wouldn't want you building something illegal." His eyes gleamed as if daring me to back down. I wiped the sweat from my brow, the salt stinging my eyes, and met his gaze head-on. "Don't worry," I said evenly, my hammer heavy in my palm. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the steady creak of his porch swing when he retreated. The structure grew stranger, more beautiful, by the day. Curved wooden beams arched upward like ribs, steel spirals twisting between them, stones stacked at the base like roots. At night, when the lights glowed, it looked like a tree made of stars, an impossible thing, both fragile and fierce. Standing beside it, I could almost hear the whisper of leaves again, smell the earthy sweetness of moss, even though none of it was real. But just as it began to feel unstoppable, I found the first sign of sabotage. One morning, nails scattered across the driveway glittered in the sun, sharp enough to puncture tires. My boots crunched over them, the metallic clink echoing in my chest. Later, I noticed bolts loosened, boards slightly shifted. Someone had been tampering. My gut twisted, the bitter taste of fear coating my tongue, but anger burned hotter. That night, I sat on the porch with a flashlight in hand, mosquitoes buzzing in my ears, their bites stinging my skin. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth after a brief rain. Hours passed, my eyes straining in the dark, until I saw it, movement by the fence. A shadow, crouched low. My breath caught, heartbeat slamming against my ribs. I stood slowly, the wood of the porch groaning under my feet. The beam of my flashlight snapped on, cutting across the yard, and for a split second, I saw him. Tom, frozen like a guilty child, one hand clutching a wrench. His face twisted, not with shame, but with fury at being caught. The light reflected off the wrench, and for the first time, I felt not just anger but danger radiating from him, sharp and electric as a live wire. My hand tightened on the flashlight, my breath sharp in my throat, as he straightened slowly, his shadow looming large against the fence. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a tree or a view anymore. This was war. Tom didn't flinch when my flashlight pinned him. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling, the wrench catching the beam like a thong. The night pressed around us, crickets buzzing high and frantic, the damp air thick with the smell of wet grass. My palms slicked with sweat, but I held the light steady, the plastic grip biting into my skin. "Caught you," I said, my voice low, almost unrecognizable to myself. He sneered, lips curling into something cruel. "You think you can build your little circus out here and no one's gonna stop you?" His words slithered into the dark, sharp as the metal in his hand. I wanted to yell, but instead my voice came out calm, too calm. "This isn't yours to stop." The silence that followed felt loaded, like the pause before thunder. Then he stepped forward, one heavy boot crushing into the gravel with a crunch. I could smell the sourness of alcohol on his breath even from a few feet away. My heart thudded, heat rising in my chest. I raised the flashlight higher, as though it were a weapon, and for a flicker of a second I considered swinging it. But before I could, the porch light behind me snapped on. Lily's small voice carried through the night, thin but trembling with bravery. "Mom? What's happening?" I turned my head just long enough to see her in the doorway, clutching the frame with both hands. That distraction was all Tom needed. When I looked back, he was already backing away, slipping into the shadows of his yard. The sound of his gate clanging shut echoed like a threat. I pulled Lily into my arms, the warmth of her body grounding me, her hair damp against my cheek from sleep sweat. "It's okay," I whispered, though my pulse said otherwise. She nodded, but her eyes searched mine, as if she knew my words were more for her comfort than my belief. The night hummed again, insects were claiming their song, but I couldn't shake the metallic tang of fear that clung to my tongue. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the structure, running my fingers over the beams. The wood was damp from dew, gritty with sawdust and dirt. Bolts loosened, nails missing, evidence of his sabotage glared back at me. My jaw clenched until it ached. It wasn't enough that he'd taken my tree, now he wanted to crush the thing I was building from its ghost. But I wasn't the same woman I'd been weeks ago. I called Marlene's nephew, asked him to reinforce the welds, to make the frame unbreakable. When his torch roared to life, sparks spitting into the afternoon air, I felt a fierce satisfaction. The steel hissed, glowing orange where the flame kissed it, and I imagined Tom watching from his window, powerless. Still, I knew this wasn't finished. That night, as I tucked Lily in, she whispered into the dark, "What if he comes back?" Her words were warm against my shoulder, tinged with sleep and fear. I smoothed her hair, the strands soft between my fingers, and said, "Then he'll find we're stronger than he thinks." But when I turned out her light, my stomach churned, because I wasn't sure if strength would be enough. Days passed, the project nearing completion. The beams curved gracefully now, the lights strung like constellations, the stones stacked solid at the base. When I stood back, sweat dripping down my spine, I almost didn't believe it was mine. Neighbors came by in small groups, murmuring their admiration, offering paint, plants, ideas. It became more than a sculpture, it became a gathering place, a pulse in the center of our street. That should have been the victory. But the tension with Tom and Carol thickened like smoke. I'd catch them at their window, blinds tilted just enough for eyes to gleam through. Once, I found Carol walking her dog suspiciously close to the structure, her perfume heavy and cloying as she lingered, her smile too sweet. "Quite a display," she said, her tone edged like glass. The dog whined, tugging the leash, and she left without another word. The real breaking point came one sweltering evening. The cicadas screamed from the trees, their droning chorus rattling the air. I was adjusting one of the light strings when a rock flew past me, striking the wood with a dull crack. My head snapped up, and there he was, Tom, standing at the edge of his yard, another rock in hand. His face was flushed red, his shirt stained with sweat, his breath loud even across the distance. "What's your problem?" I shouted, the heat of fury flooding my face. My voice carried, neighbors' doors cracking open, heads turning. He didn't answer at first, just hurled the second rock. It missed, tumbling into the dirt, but the message was clear. Then his voice ripped out of him, raw and jagged. "You ruined everything. My view, my peace, my life." His words echoed, absurd and venomous. My hand shook, but I held his gaze. "You destroyed my tree," I said, the words tasting like iron. "This is me taking it back." The crowd that had gathered murmured, their whispers swirling like wind. For the first time, Tom looked around and realized he wasn't just shouting at me, he was exposed. He cursed under his breath, stormed back toward his porch, the slam of his door reverberating across the street. But even as the neighbors drifted away, I couldn't shake the sight of him, veins bulging, eyes wild. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a whisper. I kept replaying his words, the rage in his voice. And then, just before dawn, I woke to a faint crackling sound. Not inside, but outside. I stumbled to the window, pulling back the curtain. Orange light flickered against the beams of the structure, shadows dancing grotesquely. The smell hit me next, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Smoke. My throat tightened, adrenaline flooding me as I realized what was happening. The air outside glowed with the beginnings of fire. I threw open the door, the wooden steps biting my bare feet, and raced into the yard. The heat licked up my skin, the smoke stung my eyes, and in the chaos, one thought pounded louder than anything else: Tom had finally crossed the line. The fire snapped alive with a roar, devouring the lower beams like a hungry animal. Sparks sprayed into the night sky, tiny comets burning out before they hit the ground. My throat burned with the acrid sting of smoke, my chest heaving as I stumbled closer, bare feet sinking into damp grass that was already warming under the heat. "No, no, no, no." The words tore out of me raw, ripped apart by panic. I grabbed the garden hose, the rubber cold and slick in my hands, and twisted the nozzle open. Water sputtered at first, then gushed, the spray hissing when it touched the flames. Steam surged upward, choking me with a wet, bitter taste. My arms trembled as I fought to direct the stream, but the fire was faster, climbing, licking, dancing higher, almost beautiful in its destruction. Behind me, Lily's scream pierced the night. "Mom!" Her voice shredded through the crackling chaos. I spun, eyes burning, and saw her at the doorway again, just like that night with Tom, but this time her face was pale with terror, her body frozen. I shouted, "Stay inside." My voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't move, not until Marlene rushed over, pulling her back, wrapping her in a blanket of arms and whispers. Relief stabbed through me, sharp as it was fleeting. The neighbors flooded out of their houses, their slippers slapping pavement, their voices overlapping in panic. Someone yelled to call the fire department, another brought a bucket, but it felt like the fire laughed at our efforts, mocking the futility of water against its hunger. The smell grew thicker, burning wood mixed with melting plastic, something sweet and poisonous clinging to the back of my throat. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just my creation burning, it was my defiance, my healing, my tree reborn. And then I saw him. Tom, standing at the edge of his porch, lit by the blaze like some grotesque statue. His face was a mask of shadows and orange glow, his arms crossed. He wasn't holding anything now, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes was proof enough. He wanted me to know it was him. My hand tightened around the hose until my knuckles burned white. I wanted to run at him, claw his face, scream his name into the air so everyone would see him for what he was. But the fire roared louder, pulling me back into its merciless orbit. When the sirens finally wailed through the night, relief should have come, but all I felt was a hollow pit in my chest. The trucks arrived, men in heavy gear leaping out, voices commanding, boots pounding. Water cannons roared, drowning the fire in sheets that shimmered under the flashing red lights. Neighbors huddled in small clusters, their whispers buzzing like flies, their eyes darting between me and Tom. I could hear Carol's voice faintly, high, sharp, insisting something I couldn't make out. My skin crawled at the sound. By dawn, the fire was out, but the structure stood blackened and twisted, like bones of some great animal left to rot. I stood there barefoot in the ash, my toes gray with soot, the air still hot around me, smelling of ruin. Lily clung to my leg, her body small and shaking. I bent to kiss her hair, tasting the salt of her tears against my lips. "It's okay," I murmured, though the lie hollowed me. She nodded against me, but her trust made my chest ache even deeper. The fire chief spoke to me, his voice heavy with exhaustion, his helmet under one arm. "We'll investigate," but his eyes flicked toward Tom's house, where the blinds were now shut tight. "It won't be easy to prove." His words felt like ice poured down my spine. Proof. As if proof mattered when you could feel the truth in your bones. For days after, I drifted like a ghost. The yard was silent, empty except for the charred skeleton of what had once been alive with color and hope. I smelled smoke everywhere, in my clothes, my hair, my skin, even when it wasn't there. At night, I'd close my eyes and still see the orange glow, hear the crackle, taste the ash. Lily drew pictures of the tree, the structure, always with flames curling at the edges, her crayons pressing so hard the paper tore. Each drawing felt like a wound pinned to the fridge. But something inside me refused to stay burned down. I started small. Clearing rubble, stone by stone, piece by piece. My hands blistered, my fingernails packed with soot, my muscles screaming. Neighbors stopped to watch, then to help. Marlene brought sandwiches, others brought paint, lumber, nails. It was quieter this time, not the same festival atmosphere, but there was a solemn determination in every gesture. As if they understood now, this wasn't just mine. It belonged to all of us. And then, one morning, as the sun spilled pale gold across the yard, something unexpected happened. Carol crossed the street. Her perfume announced her before her knock on the post did, that sharp, floral sweetness. I turned, hammer still in hand, sweat stinging my eyes. She looked smaller than I remembered, her arms crossed not in defiance, but in discomfort. I didn't know he'd. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said softly, her gaze skittering across the ground. My hammer felt heavy, my throat tight. "But you knew enough," I answered. The silence after hung thick, heavier than smoke. She pressed something into my hand, an envelope, thick and slightly crumpled. "Do what you want with it." Her eyes flicked to my face, then away again. She walked back before I could answer, her heels tapping like a clock counting down. Inside the envelope were photographs, grainy, but clear enough. Tom, in the night, lighter in hand, his face half-lit by the flame he fed. My breath caught, the proof I thought I'd never have was suddenly mine, trembling in my fingers. The weight of choice pressed down on me. I could take these to the police, expose him, maybe end this war once and for all. Or I could keep them, use them as a shield, a silent threat, power balanced in my pocket. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, or maybe that was just my imagination. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as I folded the envelope shut. That night, I stood at my window, staring across the street. His blinds were open just enough for me to see him sitting in the dark, a beer in hand, staring back. I raised the envelope, just enough for him to see the edge of it in the glass reflection of my window. His head jerked, his jaw tightened, and he turned away. For the first time, he looked smaller than me. I don't know what will come next. The structure will rise again, stronger, brighter, stitched with the resilience of everyone who touched it. But the shadow across the street won't vanish easily. Maybe it never will. Maybe that's the point. Some scars don't disappear, they remind you, every time you trace them, of the fire you survived. And as I lay down that night, Lily curled into me, her breath warm against my arm. I whispered into the darkness, "He can burn what I build, but he can't burn me." The words settled into the silence like embers, glowing faint but unyielding. Outside, the night hummed with crickets again, steady, relentless, alive.